What is up, people? Welcome back to 4Bet Blind. My name is Will. I'm back at the greatest poker room in the world, Portland Meadows Poker, playing a $300 six max tournament with over $7,000 for first. This was one of those magical tournament runs you dream about with tons of hands, so let's dive right in. The first interesting hand starts when I look down at pocket queens in the low jack. The blinds are 300-600, so I open to 1.2k. A loose player on the button makes the call before an unknown player in this small blind 3-bets to 4.8k. This is a pretty small raise, and I'm not super inclined to go multi-way, so I decide a 4-bet is in order. I don't need to go too large though, being in position, so I make it 10k. The button folds and the small blind begins deliberating. I'm not super worried about a jam, as this guy seemed pretty loose.
All in down here.
Fuck, well, I'm not 4-bet folding queens. I snap. The good news is my opponent tells me he doesn't have aces. The bad news is my opponent tells me he has kings. Let's go to the run out.
Just not gonna fold queens at this tournament.
Oh, no way.
Just not in the mood.
Oh!
Nice hit.
And just like that, my tournament is over. Thanks for watching, people. See y'all next episode. Okay, seriously though, I know a lot of you watching are probably wondering, why did you 4-bet? You could have just called. And I gotta tell you people, you are right. Look, I primarily cut my teeth in online tournaments, not so much now, but definitely a few years ago. And if we look at some MTT charts and the low jack response to a small blind 3-bet, queens are not a hand that's flat calling well ever. The problem with using this chart, however, is that it assumes the small blind is going to have bluffs like 9-10 suited, ace-9 suited, king-9 suited at relatively high frequency. But in reality, rather than this being something that happens at relatively high frequency, I think this is more like me experiencing the loving embrace of a woman. It just doesn't happen. Once we start removing those hands from our opponent's range, 4-betting becomes much less attractive. So lesson learned, my tournament is over. Thankfully, there are tons of cash games running, so I buy in for $400 and take a seat at a 1-2 table. The first hand of note starts with a button straddle to $5, a call from the small blind and big blind, and me looking down a king-jack offsuit in the low jack. I raise to $30, and the button, small blind, and big blind all make the call, so we're going 4 ways to a flop that comes tray 7-9 with 2 spades. The small blind and big blind check to me, and I check as well. The button is feeling slightly less friendly, however, as he rips all in for his remaining $88. It folds back to me, and with only king high, I make a fairly typical fold. Just kidding, this is an incredibly marginal spot, so you know I'm going to be dumping chips in. More seriously, I'm getting over 2-to-1 odds here and only need about 29% equity. I expect my opponent to make this move with any sort of straight draw, any sort of flush draw, as well as some 7x, 9x, and maybe some pocket pair type hands. With 2 overs, backdoor spades, and some backdoor straight possibilities, I think this hand is just good enough to make the call, so I put the chips in. Off to a run out, which brings the 4 of spades on the turn and the 5 of hearts on the river. As you can see, my opponent had 8-10 offsuit for a bricked open-ended straight draw, so I take this one down. Happy to be on the right side of variance this time. Before we move on to the next hand, I want to take a quick moment to shout out Justin, a player who was so desperate to get on the vlog he actually paid my small blind, after which he did this dance movement or had a stroke at the table. I'm not exactly sure which, but shout out to Justin, thanks for the support, man, and it was super fun playing with you. Okay, back to poker. This hand starts with 2 players limping when I look down at pocket jacks on the button. I raise to 15 and get called by the big blind and both limpers. Off to the flop, which comes 3-8-3 rainbow. The big blind checks before the first limper donks for $10. The hijack folds, and I'm looking to get value with my overpair, so I raise to 50. The big blind folds and the limper makes the call. Heads up to the turn now, which comes the 9 of hearts. He checks, and I think I can get a little bit more value from hands like pocket 7s and maybe an 8. I don't want to go too large though, so I settle for the same size as last street, $50. My opponent takes a few moments to consider his options before flicking in the call. The river is an innocuous 4 of clubs, and my opponent checks once more. My opponent hasn't shown much strength yet, and I think I might be able to squeeze one more street of value. I don't expect him to call a ton of worse hands, so I try and keep the bet on the small side, betting 80 into 260 and laying my opponent better than 3-1 odds. The good news is my opponent goes into the tank. He's taking quite some time to make this decision, and I'm happy to see him carve out a stack of around 80 chips, getting ready to make the call. What? Dude, what is that other stack? No, it's only 80, dude. No! Obviously, I snap muck. I can't beat quads or whatever the hell nutted hand this guy had. But nice hand and well played to my opponent, who I'm calling Indiana Jones, not because he did anything adventurous, but rather because when he touched his chips, they let off a massive cloud of dust like they were ancient artifacts that hadn't been touched in centuries. Later on, there's an under the gun open to $10 when I'm dealt pocket queens next to act. I 3-bet to 35 and it folds all the way back to the original raiser, who goes for the 4-bet to 105. This represents a lot of strength here, but unless my opponent looks like he could have starred in one of those life alert commercials, I'm never folding. So I make the call and we go heads up to a flop, which comes Jack 7-4 rainbow. My opponent continues his aggression with a bet of $50 and I make the call. Before the turn comes, I make the decision that I'm probably going to be folding to most double barrels, as I just don't see many people constructing 4-bet bluff ranges in this spot. However, the turn removes all doubt about what I'll do when it comes the king of clubs. Now that I'm losing to all the ace-king combos as well, there's not much left to do but muck, even when my opponent picks the ridiculously good price of $80. Thankfully, my opponent was kind enough to show the king-jack of spades for turn 2 pair. So well played by him, he definitely was capable of having a bluff combo here, and I probably would have folded the best hand if he had pressed the issue. Nice hand, Kobe, or Colby, I can't remember the spelling, but it was fun playing with you, man. Speaking of 4-bet bluff ranges, the next hand starts with me looking down at the lovely ace-4 of hearts in early position. I open to $10 and get called by the low jack and high jack before our friend Indiana Jones manages to excavate some chips from his stack for a 3-bet to 35. It folds back to me, and this is an interesting spot. On one hand, this is one of those 4-bet bluff candidates, as I block aces and ace-king while retaining strong playability post-flop. My opponent also picked a ridiculously small size here, which doesn't indicate a ton of strength. On the other hand, I compared my opponent's chips to archaeological artifacts that hadn't seen human touch in centuries. In game, I decide to just go for the call here, though I think folding is perfectly defensible. I think we go 3 or 4 ways to the flop very frequently, so we're getting a pretty good price. Additionally, I get to see a turn card very often, as most players will automatically check to a preflop 3-better, and in-position 3-betters have a tendency to play a hyperpolar bet strategy with a high check frequency. So I make the call, along with the low jack, before the high jack folds. So 3 ways to a flop that's pretty decent. It's king deuce 7 with 2 hearts. I check, the low jack checks, and it gets to the button, who reaches for a stack of chips before ultimately deciding on a check. Kind of a weird live tell there. We're still 3-handed though, and we go to a turn that brings the 10 of spades. I decide this is a good time to start bluffing, so I bet 60, around half pot. Only the low jack makes the call as the button quickly folds, so we're going heads up to a river looking for some help. I guess the universe is finally punishing me for stealing Daniel Hansen's string cheese during recess in the 2nd grade, as the river is the deuce of clubs. Just kidding, it's the 3 of hearts. Fuck you, Daniel, your string cheese was delicious. I've got the nuts, now I just need to figure out how much to bet. It's pretty hard for my opponent to have a super strong hand, as he only smooth called the turn. In the end, I settle on a size of 165, just about 2/3 pot, hoping he might find a call with a King X type hand. Now the universe is punishing me, as my opponent pretty quickly folds. Daniel, I'm sorry, I was a different person back then. Leave a comment on this web zone if you want me to send you a string cheese. A little while later, it folds to me in the hijack, where I'm dealt ace-10 offsuit. I open to $10 and it folds to the big blind, who basically min 3-bets to $20. This hand is pretty garbage versus their 3-bet range, but getting this good a price in position, I think I can make the call. The flop comes 9-8-6 with 2 clubs, so not only do I flop decent equity with a gutter and backdoor clubs, there's also a lot of runouts I'm going to be able to bluff on. So when my opponent c-bets for $20, I have a fairly easy call. The turn is the 10 of spades, giving me top pair while also putting a 4-liner on board. My opponent checks, and now that I have quite a bit of showdown value, I decide to check back. The river brings the 4 of clubs, and when my opponent checks once more, I am really tempted to turn this hand into a bluff. Granted, I am beating a ton of hands in my opponent's range, hands like ace-king, ace-queen, and maybe even some ace-jack and king-queen. But the times my opponent does have a hand like pocket queens, they're going to be hard-pressed to call this river if I put in a big bet. In the end, I turn into a beta male and settle for the nitty option and check it back. My opponent shows pocket jacks, and I feel a bit like an idiot. My final analysis of this hand is that checking back and getting to showdown wins a ton of money in this spot, but betting pot and getting my opponent to fold basically everything wins more. Alright, last hand of the session starts with an under the gun raise to 10 and a call from the cutoff. I'm in the small blind with pocket 9s. This is definitely a 3-bet candidate, but considering the raise came from under the gun and the flatter seems pretty nitty, I decide to just call. The big blind calls as well, so we're going 4 ways to a flop that comes 8-5-8 two-tone. It checks to the original raiser, who c-bets for 20. The cutoff folds, and considering this is not a board people c-bet very frequently, I decide to just call. The big blind folds, and the 2 of us see a 3 of clubs on the turn. I check again, and this time my opponent bets 50. I don't like this spot, as now I'm losing to most of my opponent's value range, but folding feels a little bit too nitty, considering I'm getting over 2-1 on a call. So I make the call once more, hoping my opponent gives up on the river. When the king of clubs falls, I check, and my opponent checks it back, so nice, I flip over the winner. Happy to take down this decent size. Bro, where are you going? Bring the chips over here, what are you... Oh, the old deuce 8 of hearts. Forgot about that premium hand. So I guess my read that my opponent was opening a very strong range in early position was a bit off. Props to my buddy Drew though for helping my nearsighted ass figure out what the hell was going on. After this, I managed to win a few small bomb pot hands and end up cashing out shortly thereafter. I was in for 600, out for 783, but I also played the $300 tournament earlier, so once you factor that in, my net for this session was minus 117. All in all, not a bad result. Also, quick announcement, the vlog is going on the road for the World Series of Poker. I'm super excited for this. I'm not exactly sure when I'm going to be there. There is a $300 tournament with a $3 million guarantee that I imagine is going to be less like a tournament and more like a fucking street fight. Leave a comment and let me know if you're going to be in Vegas at all and what events you're playing. Also, I'm on Instagram at 4betblind if you want to follow along in real time and get updates on what I'm doing, or shoot me a DM. Thanks for watching, see y'all in the next one.